If you have ever looked at your investment account and felt insulted by how small the progress seemed, I want you to know that the feeling is not a sign that you are failing. It is a sign that you are standing in the hardest part of wealth building. The beginning is not glamorous. The beginning is heavy. The beginning is the stretch, where you do almost all the work, and the money does almost none of it for you. That is why they think the system is broken because the machine has not started sounding powerful yet. But the machine is not broken. It is simply underloaded. That is the first truth. The second truth is more important. Wealth does not grow in a straight line. It grows in thresholds. There are levels where the experience of building money changes so dramatically that once you pass them, you stop feeling as though you are dragging your future uphill by hand and start feeling as though your capital has finally begun developing a motive force of its own. That is what I want to talk about. Not generic motivation, not another lecture about saving money, because it is the responsible thing to do. I want to talk about the 3 net worth milestones that change the behavior of the machine itself, because most people are trying to stay disciplined without understanding what discipline is carrying them toward. That makes the process much harder than it needs to be. People can endure a great deal of discomfort if they understand the physics on the other side of it. They become hopeless when the work feels endless and the result feels invisible. That is why I think so many intelligent people quit too early. They mistake the slow phase for the whole story. They think the first slope is the mountain. It is not. It is only the launch ramp. When I was younger, I learned a lesson that has stayed with me for most of my life. The market does not pay you most generously for excitement. It pays you most generously for staying in the right game long enough for invisible forces to become visible. That is true in business. It is true in investing. And it is especially true in personal wealth. At the beginning, your savings feel like buckets of water being poured into a nearly dry well. You hear the splash. You do not yet hear any echo of abundance coming back. Then one day, the well is deep enough that the water starts holding, then deeper still, until what you poured in yesterday is helping pull more water upward today. Eventually, the system becomes self-reinforcing. Most people never reach that stage because they were expecting applause in the bucket stage. The bucket stage has no applause, only weight. That is why I want to start with a different metaphor than the one people usually use. Most people describe compounding as a snowball. That is fine. I want you to think about it as ignition temperature. A fire does not burn the same way at every stage. At first, you are crouched over the kindling, working far harder than the flames suggest should be necessary. You feed it, you protect it, you keep it alive. The room stays cold, the effort feels disproportionate. If you leave too early, the fire dies and you say there was never much heat there anyway. But if you stay, something changes. The kindling catches the larger wood starts doing its own work. Then the room changes, then the fire becomes the dominant force in the space. That is wealth. The first stage is fragile. The second stage is The third stage is transformative. And most people either never learn that or never behave as though they believe it. The first milestone is 10,000. I know that does not sound glamorous. That is one reason it matters. 10,000 is not the point where you are free. It is not the point where you retire. It is not the point where your neighbors suddenly think you are a genius. It is the point where you have finally proven that you can produce investable capital on command. That matters much more than people think. The first 10,000 is not impressive because of the number. It is impressive because of what the number proves. It proves you can convert labor into ownership. It proves you can delay gratification repeatedly enough for the process to become real. It proves you can resist the 1,000 little demands modern life makes on every dollar before it reaches the future. And that is no small thing. Most people never prove that to themselves. They spend years saying they want wealth without ever crossing the line where wanting becomes behavior. That is what 10,000 means, not wealth itself. A behavioral break with the average person. I want you to think about what has to happen before someone accumulates that first serious pool of capital. He must save through weeks when it feels pointless. He must invest while the account balance still looks too small to inspire him. He must continue even though almost all visible progress is coming from his own contributions, not from the market doing anything impressive. That is the psychological war. Nobody warns people about this properly. They talk about returns, as if returns show up early and encourage you. Usually they do not. Usually the early years are an exercise in faith. Not because the mathematics are uncertain, but because the mathematics have not yet become emotionally legible. This is what the first milestone changes. It turns the abstract into the visible. When you cross 10,000, you are still doing most of the lifting. Yes, but the machine is now large enough that you can at least begin to see that the machine exists. That matters. Because a person who sees the machine differently behaves differently. He stops feeling like an amateur making symbolic gestures toward adulthood and starts feeling like an owner of capital. Even if the capital is still modest, identity matters enormously here. People think wealth is built by tactics. Wealth is built by identity first and tactics second. A person who sees himself as someone who accumulates ownership behaves differently from a person who sees investing as a side hobby or a moral chore. 10,000 is often where that identity begins. This is why I am so severe with young people who delay getting started, because the amounts feel too small to matter. $100 matters. $50 matters. A workplace contribution matters. A matched retirement contribution matters. A tax, advantaged account matters. What people call small is often only early. They confuse the two. Early money does not look impressive because the account is small. Its power is not in its size. Its power is in its time. That is what the crowd cannot feel. The crowd always admires scale and underprices time. That is why the crowd is late. If you can get to 10,000, you have done something far more valuable than simply building a balance. You have built proof of concept. You have built the evidence that your future does not depend solely on how much effort you can sell in the labor market this month. That is the first fracture in the old life. It is the beginning of separation from total dependence on wages. Not enough separation to feel free, enough separation to feel possibility. And possibility is often what keeps people going through the next long stretch. Now, I want to say something else about the first milestone, because this is where a lot of people sabotage themselves with the wrong thought. They get to 10,000 and think, this still is not enough. They are right in one sense and wrong in a much more dangerous one. It is not enough to retire. It is enough to dismissing it because it is not yet final is one of the stupidest habits in finance. A sapling is not a forest. That does not make it meaningless. A runway is not a flight. That does not make it optional. The first milestone is not supposed to finish the story. It is supposed to prove the story can exist. Now let us move to the second milestone, because this is where the machine changes character. 100,000. This is the point where wealth stops feeling like a side effect of discipline and starts feeling like a living force that can create motion on its own. That is why this threshold matters so much. 10,000 proves you can build. 100,000 proves the money can start building with you. This is the point where compounding stops whispering and starts speaking clearly enough that even impatient people finally hear it. At smaller balances, a respectable market return still produces an amount of growth that feels emotionally overshadowed by your own labor. You save, you sacrifice, you contribute, and the market adds a little fine. At 100,000, the market's contribution becomes large enough that you can no longer dismiss it as trivial. The capital begins generating results that resemble part of an income stream. Not enough to replace work for most people. Enough to change your relationship with work. That is different. Imagine 100,000 earning 8% over time. That is 8,000 in annual growth before taxes, and before all the caveats people love to recite. 8,000 is not retirement. 8,000 is not freedom in the absolute sense, but 8,000 is meaningful. It is the beginning of your money doing work that would once have required your time, your labor, your commute, your meetings, your stress. That changes how you think. 100,000 is the milestone where many people first understand emotionally, not just intellectually, that capital can be employed like a silent worker. That is a profound shift, Once you see money as a worker rather than a number, you begin treating it differently. You stop asking what would make you feel richer this month and start asking how many workers you are sending into the future. You stop seeing contribution amounts as losses of present enjoyment and start seeing them as hires. Each additional dollar is another recruit. That is how serious wealth builders think. Not about deprivation, about payroll. Every dollar invested into productive assets is a future worker who, if treated properly, will show up every year without complaining, without needing motivation, without calling in sick, and without asking your permission to compound. This is why the second milestone is so dangerous, if misunderstood, and so powerful if respected. Some people reach 100,000 and get intoxicated by it. They start believing the machine is now unstoppable, and therefore discipline can relax. That is a mistake. What 100,000 buys is not permission to become lazy. It buys evidence that discipline now has a real accomplice. That is a much better way to understand it. The machine is helping. You are still responsible for feeding it. This is also where the idea people now call coast fire begins to make emotional sense. If you front-load enough capital early, then time begins doing so much work that future contributions become less central than the runway remaining. I am not interested in selling people dreams about never having to contribute again at 35. That is a lifestyle theory, not a universal financial truth. What matters more than the doctrine is the principle beneath it. Once you accumulate enough capital early enough, the marginal contribution of time becomes enormous. That means every extra dollar is not equal at every age. A dollar invested with 30 years ahead of it is not just a dollar. It is a timed explosive inside the compounding engine. That is why I tell people that the first 100,000 is not merely a bigger version of the first 10. It is a different category of event. 100,000 says the machine has enough mass that time itself can begin acting like an accomplice rather than a background condition. This is the stage where quitting becomes especially tragic, because the person who walks away at 100,000 is walking away not simply from saved money, but from the acceleration phase of the process. He is leaving right when the engine starts sounding like an engine. That is what people do not understand. They think the pain was the process. Often the pain was only admission. You were paying your way into the acceleration zone. That is why staying matters so much. And this is also why employer matches, tax relief, and retirement structures matter more than many people appreciate. If your workplace gives you match contributions and you do not capture them, then you are not simply missing free money in the vulgar way people describe it. You are forfeiting acceleration fuel. If the government provides tax relief on contributions and you ignore it, you are not merely being casual. You are slowing the speed at which you reach ignition. Everything that gets you to 100,000 faster changes the entire shape of the future. That is why structure matters so much. The account type matters, the employer match matters, the tax treatment matters, the consistency matters, the amount matters, but above all, the continuity matters. Because 100,000 is not created by brilliance nearly as often as it is created by uninterrupted process. That is one reason wealth building often looks boring while it is happening. And boredom is one of the prices you pay for asymmetry. The crowd wants exhilaration. Exhilaration usually demands that you reset the process over and over again. Wealth wants repetition. Repetition is quiet. And because it is quiet, people underestimate its power. Now, the third milestone is the one everyone loves to romanticize, but almost nobody understands correctly. The million is not magical in the childish sense. It is not the number where the heavens open, the clouds part, and all uncertainty leaves your life. It is the point where your capital becomes large enough that work itself begins changing category. Before this threshold, work is usually compulsory. After it, work starts becoming increasingly optional, not necessarily because you stop earning, but because your capital can now produce enough that your labor is no longer the only meaningful economic engine in your life. That is what changes everything. People love the million because it sounds round, cinematic, clean. I care about it for colder reasons. At $1 million, ordinary long-term returns generate results that resemble a salary. Not always a luxurious one, but a real one. This matters because labor and capital no longer feel like parent and child. They feel like colleagues. That is a very different life. If your money can produce an amount each year that begins rivaling, supplementing, or eventually overtaking what your labor alone once provided, then your relationship to time changes. You negotiate differently, you work differently, you take risk differently, you imagine the future differently. This is why I say $1 million changes more than a balance. It changes bargaining power, and bargaining power is one of the truest forms of wealth. A person whose life depends entirely on next month's paycheck is not bargaining from strength, no matter how nice his title sounds. A person whose capital now throws off meaningful growth year after year is living inside a different architecture of choice. That architecture is what people are actually seeking when they say they want money. They are not seeking numbers. They are seeking the power to reclaim time, attention, dignity, and choice from systems that would otherwise dictate them. The million is where that starts becoming not theoretical, but operational. Now, let me be responsible and say what needs saying. $1 million is not what it used to be. Inflation matters. Location matters. Taxes matter. Life expectancy matters. Withdrawal rules matter. The much-abused 4% rule is not a religion. It is a rough planning device for one kind of world, not all worlds. Fine, all true. None of that changes the deeper point. The deeper point is that once your capital base is large enough, the compounding itself can begin reveling labor income in a way that transforms your life. Whether that number is $1 million, $2 million, or some other figure, depending on where you live, is a secondary debate. The milestone still matters because it marks the point at which the machine is now large enough to generate serious independent force. That is why so many people describe $1 million as a turning point, even if they have no intention of retiring immediately. It is not retirement that changes first. It is identity. You stop thinking of yourself only as a worker who saves. You begin thinking of yourself as a capital owner whose work is now a choice about expansion, not a desperate condition for survival. That identity shift is one of the most powerful emotional changes in all of finance, and it is why the $1 million threshold matters so much psychologically, even beyond the arithmetic. Now I want to address the beginning again, because that is where almost everyone listening will either win or lose. The beginning feels offensive. That is the best word for it. You save for years. The returns seem insulting, the sacrifices feel visible, and the gains feel invisible. This is where almost everybody around you will quit. They will say they want to enjoy life instead. They will say the market is too uncertain. They will say the amount is too small to matter. They will say they can start later when they earn more. They will say they missed the best time. They will say there is no point unless they can do it perfectly. These are the languages of surrender, and they sound intelligent, because surrender usually arrives wearing practicality. I do not admire that practicality. It is expensive cowardice. If you can keep moving through the first stage, then the first milestone arrives. That proves behavior. If you can keep moving through the long middle, then the second milestone arrives. That proves the machine. If you can keep moving long enough, wisely enough, and patiently enough, then the third milestone arrives. That proves the machine can now begin renegotiating your life. Those are the three transformations: behavior, machine, renegotiation. I do not care what cute labels the internet gives them. That is what they are. And because they are structural, not motivational, they can be pursued with discipline rather than depending on how inspired you feel this month. That is the whole point. Wealth should not depend on inspiration. It should depend on system. This is why I tell people to automate the process as early as possible. Not because automation is clever, because your emotions are unreliable payroll managers. If every month you must decide again whether your future matters, you are asking a frightened animal to vote on a long-term strategy. That is a ridiculous way to build wealth. Set the contribution, set the account, capture the match, use the tax shelter, buy productive assets. Repeat. That is the process. It is not sexy. It is not supposed to be sexy. It is supposed to work. And if you stick with it, one day you will notice something deeply satisfying. The machine begins making progress on days you were not even thinking about it. That is what people mean when they say the money is working. The phrase sounds simple. The lived experience is astonishing. To wake up and realize that your capital made more while you were asleep than it once made in a month is not merely a financial event. It is a philosophical one. It changes how you think about life, effort, patience, and time itself. This is also why envy is such a stupid emotion in finance. People see someone at the later milestone and compare it to their own early stage as if the two belong to the same category. They do not. The person with $1 million is not simply 100 times ahead of the person at 10,000. He is in a different phase of the machine. He spent years in the ugly stage. What you are seeing now is not ease. It is delayed visibility. That is why I have so little patience for people who say wealth must be luck, because the later stages look almost supernatural compared to the early ones. The later stages look supernatural only if you ignore the years when the machine looked too small to matter. That is the whole trick. The invisible years are real, and they are where wealth is actually decided. Now, I also want to say this. Money is a tool, not a religion, not a substitute for life, not a thing worth sacrificing your health, relationships, curiosity, or entire humanity to worship. I have seen too many people build large numbers and small lives. That is not my ambition for you. The milestones matter because they create freedom. Freedom is useful only if you remember what it is for. To work because you choose to help people you love, to breathe, to stop living in monthly fear, to reclaim time, to build something meaningful. If you forget that and turn the number into an idol, the whole process rots from the inside. That is why I prefer thinking in terms of power and choice rather than status and scorekeeping. 10,000 gives you proof. 100,000 gives you force. 1 million gives you. What you do with that leverage is where the quality of life finally re-enters the story. Now let me give you the practical consequence of all this, because theory without action is just elegant procrastination. Start now, that is not a slogan. It is arithmetic. The earlier dollar is worth more than the later dollar because time is not neutral. If you have access to an employer match, use it. If you have access to tax-advantaged accounts, use them. If you cannot contribute much, contribute something. If you are embarrassed by the amount, good. Embarrassment is not a reason to delay. It is a reason to begin before the embarrassment compounds into regret. If you need to increase your income, do that. If you need to cut some leakage, do that, but do not make the early stage any longer than it already is by pretending you are above it. No one is above it. Everyone who built serious wealth walked through the slow phase first. Everyone, that is one of the few truly democratic truths in money. The millionaire was once annoyed by his first few hundred. The person whose portfolio now makes more than some people earn at work once stared at tiny green numbers and wondered whether any of it would ever matter. The only real difference is that he kept going. That is what the milestones reward, not genius. Continuation, not perfect timing. Continuation, not confidence. Continuation. Continuation is what allows the thresholds to reveal themselves. Here is the final test I would give you. If I took away the current balance and showed you only your system, your contribution habits, your account structure, your use of matches, your use of tax shelters, and your willingness to keep going through the unglamorous phase, would I conclude that you are headed toward the thresholds or away from them? That is the real question, because net worth milestones are not prizes handed out by fate. They are outcomes produced by repeated behavior meeting enough time. That is all the contract I would make with my future self is simple. I will not insult small beginnings. I will not confuse slow progress with broken mathematics. I will respect the first threshold because it proves behavior. I will respect the second because it proves the machine. I will respect the third because it begins renegotiating my dependence on labor. I will automate what can be automated. I will take every intelligent advantage available. I will keep going when the early phase feels too small to matter. And I will remember that wealth usually changes everything, not in the moment you start, but in the moment you finally cross a threshold you spent years thinking was too far away to be real. That is when the story turns. And if you keep going, it will turn for you too.